The frontier in setting the historical context. 1855 Kentucky Highlands. The family that vanished beneath the coal mine in the year 1855. The Kentucky Highlands stood as a land caught between untamed wilderness and the slow advance of industry. Rolling green ridges stretched for miles, draped in dense forests that swayed and whispered with every breath of wind. Creeks gurgled through hollows lined with wildflowers, and the air was rich with the scent of damp earth and pine. But beneath that beauty, hidden in the shadowed depths of the earth, lay something that drew men from miles around: coal. The black stone was beginning to fuel America's hunger for progress, and in this corner of Kentucky, it was whispered that the richest seams lay just beneath the high ridges and narrow valleys. The Hollingsworth family had arrived that spring, moving from Virginia in search of a new life. James Hollingsworth was a tall, wiry man hardened by years of labor on rocky soil. His wife, Margaret, possessed a quiet grace but also a sharp mind. She could read, figure numbers, and had a memory like a ledger. Their 3 children brought life to their small cabin: Thomas, 14, already learning the skills of a woodsman; Sarah, 10, whose curious eyes missed nothing; and little Eli, only 5, with a laugh that carried through the hills like a songbird's call. They settled at the edge of Briar Hollow, a mining settlement that was more a scattering of cabins and tents than a true town. Smoke from iron stoves curled above rooftops, mingling with the coal dust that clung to every surface. The miners were a rough but tight-knit community, bound by the dangerous work that sent them each day into the earth's black throat. The Hollingsworths, though not miners themselves, were drawn into the rhythm of the place. They traded eggs and cured meat for tools, shared coffee with neighbors at sunrise, and listened at night to the low hum of miners' songs drifting up from the hollow. Life, in those early months, seemed full of promise. The soil was rich enough for crops, the creek nearby teemed with fish, and the children roamed the woods freely. But there were also whispers, murmured over whiskey in the lamplight, of strange happenings deep in the mines. Some said there were old tunnels, carved long before white settlers arrived, leading into chambers no one dared explore. Others spoke of collapses without warning, of eerie drafts that carried voices where no man worked. A few, lowering their voices still further, told of families in years past who had come to these hills and were never seen again. One summer evening, James returned from town with news that a new shaft was being dug not far from their land. The mine owners claimed it would bring jobs, progress, and prosperity, but the older miners only frowned and shook their heads. The mountain, they said, had ways of keeping its secrets. Still, in a frontier land where opportunity was scarce, no one could resist the lure of black gold beneath their feet. As the days grew longer, and the heat of summer pressed down, strange things began to happen around the Hollingsworth cabin. Thomas swore he heard knocking from the hills at night, as if someone were striking rock deep underground. Sarah spoke of a low humming sound that seemed to come from the creek bed, though no one else could hear it. And Margaret, waking in the dark hours before dawn, felt the ground shudder beneath her bed, like the earth itself was breathing. James dismissed these things as the fancies of an overactive mind. Yet, he could not ignore what happened next. One afternoon, while tending the corn rows, he saw Eli standing at the edge of the woods, staring into the shadows. When James called, the boy did not turn. Only when he touched Eli's shoulder did the child look up, eyes wide and unfocused, and whisper, "They want us to come inside." When pressed, Eli said nothing more. It was only a week later that the Hollingsworth family was seen for the last time. On a gray morning in early September, smoke still rose from the chimney, and a kettle steamed on the stove. The table was set for breakfast. But the cabin was empty. Neighbors searched the woods, the creek, the old trails, nothing. Then someone noticed footprints in the soft earth near the new mine shaft, small and large, leading toward the yawning black mouth of the earth. They ended at the edge of the shaft. No sign of a fall, no signs of struggle. Just nothing, The search lasted for days. Lanterns were lowered into the shaft, their light swallowed by the darkness. The miners refused to go deeper, claiming they heard voices calling to them from the rock, voices that spoke in tones too low to understand yet impossible to ignore. One man swore he saw figures moving in the shadows far below, though no one believed him. Or perhaps no one wanted to be. By the time autumn arrived, the mine was sealed. The owners called it unsafe, but in Briar Hollow, the truth was spoken only in whispers. The mountain had taken the Hollingsworths, just as it had taken others before. And in the stillest nights, when the wind blew from the north, some swore you could hear the faint ringing of a hammer on stone, and the laughter of a little boy echoing from deep within the hills. The Kentucky Highlands went on. More families came, more mines opened, and the world outside moved forward. But in that corner of the frontier, the story of the Hollingsworth family lived on, a reminder that in 1855, in the wild and restless heart of the Highlands, the promise of the land came with a price, and some prices were paid not in gold or coal, but in the lives that vanished without a trace. In the sweltering summer of 1855, the Kentucky Highlands lay heavy under the weight of heat and silence. The ridges rose dark and jagged, casting shadows that stretched like bony fingers across the narrow hollows. Briar Hollow, a small settlement carved into the wilderness, seemed almost untouched by time, but beneath its quiet surface, something ancient was stirring. It began subtly, so much so that few even noticed at first. Pale flickers of light, ghostly, almost liquid in their shimmer, appeared in the low-lying mists at night. They danced between the tree trunks, gliding just above the ground, vanishing when approached. Margaret Whitlock, strong-willed and quick-eyed, was the first in her family to take notice. One night while drawing water from the well, she paused mid-motion, the bucket rope creaking in her hand. Across the field, in the fog that curled along the old creek bed, a faint silver glow pulsed, not steady, not natural. She swore she saw shapes moving inside it, slow and deliberate, as if watching her. Her daughter Sarah, only 12 years old, had her own story. She whispered to her mother that she could hear knocking, hollow, rhythmic, rising from beneath the floorboards of their home after dark. Always 3 knocks, a pause, then 2 more. Sometimes it came from under the parlor, sometimes from beneath her bedroom. James Whitlock, her father, was a man of practical mind and hard labor. He dismissed it all as nonsense. Would beams shift in the heat, he reasoned. The sound of raccoons, or perhaps a fox taking shelter under the house. But his calm explanations didn't still the unease that settled into the family's bones. Then, on an August morning, that calm shattered. A dull tremor passed through Briar Hollow. Not an earthquake, but something close. The sound came first, like the tearing of fabric deep underground. Then the earth itself gave way beneath Elijah Turner's barn, the timbers groaning before collapsing in a deafening roar. 2 of Elijah's best draft horses went down with it, their cries echoing through the valley before silence took them. When the dust settled, the ground where the barn had stood was gone, replaced by a yawning black wound in the earth. A sinkhole, the preacher called it. But the older folk in the hollow avoided the sight, muttering about old mining shafts that ran for miles under these hills, dug long before anyone could remember. The collapse spread fear faster than any sermon could calm. Livestock were penned closer, children forbidden from straying near the creek or the ridges after dark. And yet, the lights in the hollow only grew bolder. More settlers began to see them, flickers moving against the darkness, always just at the edge of vision point. One night, Margaret woke to find the front door hanging wide open. James swore he'd locked it. A damp smell, like wet stone and deep soil, drifted into the house. Sarah's room was empty. Panic rose like floodwater in James's chest. They found her outside, barefoot in the yard, staring toward the tree line. The mist clung to her nightgown, and her eyes reflected the pale light from somewhere deep in the hollow. She didn't speak a word, only whispered that they had been calling her name. From that night on, the knocking beneath the floorboards grew louder, and then the Whitlock family vanished. When neighbors came calling 2 days later, the front door stood ajar again. A stew pot simmered unattended on the hearth. The chairs were overturned. But the beds were empty, the house silent. And in the yard, fresh in the damp soil, were footprints, not just of boots, but of something else. Something long-toed, the impressions deep, leading toward the direction of the old mine shafts. By autumn, whispers spread that the Whitlocks had been taken, not by men, but by the same strange lights that had haunted the hollow all summer. Elijah Turner swore that on the night they vanished, he'd seen those pale flickers disappear into the earth itself, and somewhere beneath the ridges of the Kentucky Highlands, deep in the black veins of abandoned coal tunnels, the hollow knocking still echoes. The year was 1855. The air in the Kentucky Highlands carried that sharp autumn bite, the kind that whispered change was coming, though not the kind anyone prayed for. The leaves blazed red and gold across the ridges, but beneath the beauty lay a tension that was growing darker with every passing day. For months, the Hollingsworth family had lived in uneasy peace after turning away the coal company's first offer. They had been promised safety, that their home, their land, their way of life would remain untouched. But deep down, James Hollingsworth knew men with gold in their eyes rarely gave up so easily, and he was right. Camera pans to a shadowy figure riding on horseback into town. By autumn, the company returned. This time, their arrival carried an air of finality. Leading them was Charles McKenna, the company foreman, a tall, sharp-featured man with a black coat that seemed to drink in the daylight. He smiled often, but only with his mouth, never with his eyes. McKenna carried himself like a man certain of his victory before the battle had even begun. He wasted no time. That very evening, he rode up the dirt path to the Hollingsworth home. Close up of McKenna speaking, he told James that coal was a gift from God meant to be taken, that the black veins running beneath these hills were the lifeblood of progress. He leaned forward in his saddle and said refusing that progress was the same as standing in the way of destiny. But James was a man carved out of the mountains themselves. His voice was calm, but his eyes were steel when he replied, "This land's been in my family long before you and your company set foot here. And it'll be in my family long after you're gone. Now get off it." Music shifts to a low, tense note. McKenna's smile froze in place. There was no yelling, no threats, not in words anyway. He tipped his hat slowly and turned his horse. But as he rode away, James saw something flicker in the foreman's eyes, something that told him the fight was far from over. 2 days later, it began. Visual. A foggy morning on the ridge. Before sunrise, Sarah Hollingsworth spotted a man moving like a shadow along the high ridge. He carried no rifle, no tools for hunting, just a strange brass instrument glinting in the morning light. A surveyor. He paced the land with deliberate steps, stopping every so often to peer through his device, marking points only he understood. This was no casual visit. This was a claim being staked in silence. Camera close up on James watching from the porch. James stood at the porch rail, fists tightening, every muscle ready to confront the trespasser. But something in him held back. Maybe it was the knowledge that this was bigger than one man with a tripod. Maybe it was the realization that the battle for this land had shifted into something far more dangerous, something that wouldn't be fought with shovels and rifles alone. And so, the Hollingsworth family watched, their breath catching in the cool air, as the surveyor's brass lens swept across the hills. The sound of his boots crunching on the frostbitten grass was the quiet drumbeat of a coming storm. Narrator voice lowers. That day, no words were exchanged. But a line had been crossed. And from that moment on, the land itself seemed to sense it. The nights grew colder, the wind howled longer, and a silence settled over the Hollingsworth home, the kind that waits for something to break. What James didn't yet know was that the company had no intention of leaving. The brass marks made on those ridges weren't just measurements. They were the first nails in a coffin being built for a family that refused to kneel. The year was 1855. In the deep folds of the Kentucky Highlands, autumn came early, draping the hills in a cold, whispering mist. The forests glowed gold and crimson, but beneath that beauty was the weight of something darker, something that had been growing for years. The Hollingsworth family had lived on this land for generations, their log cabins standing watch over the valleys like a stubborn sentinel. The soil was rocky, but the woods gave them game, and the streams ran with clear water. They had fought through blizzards, wildcat raids, and lean harvests. But nothing had prepared them for this, because that autumn, the mining company came back. And this time, they didn't come asking. The head of their delegation was Charles McKenna, a tall, wiry man whose smile was nothing more than a weapon sheathed in politeness. His coat was fine for these hills, too fine, the wool almost untouched by the mud that swallowed everyone else's boots. But his eyes never smiled. McKenna told James Hollingsworth that coal was a gift from God, placed in these hills for men of progress to take. Refusing to let them mine it, he said, was like standing in the way of destiny itself. James listened. Then he told McKenna to leave his land. There was no shouting, no dramatic fight. Only the cold wind between them, and McKenna's final words before turning away. "You might be able to stop a man, but you can't stop what's coming." 2 days later, a surveyor was spotted on Hollingsworth land. He was pacing the ridges with a strange brass instrument, its polished curves catching the pale sunlight. He made careful notes, his gloved hand scratching quickly over the paper. When James's eldest son, Thomas, asked him what he thought he was doing, the man didn't answer. He just kept looking through the instrument, as though he could see something the rest of them could not. By nightfall, the tracks from the surveyor's boots had been erased by the mountain fog. But that same night, the dogs barked for hours, and no one could find the reason why. Mary Hollingsworth, James's wife, swore she heard a low rumbling in the ground when she went to draw water. Not thunder, no storm was near. It was something deeper, something alive beneath the soil. Over the next week, the rumbling came again. Sometimes in the dead of night. Sometimes just after dawn. Always short. Always gone before anyone could find the source. Neighbors began to whisper that the company was tunneling already, perhaps from the far side of the ridge. But James knew that was impossible. The distance, the rock, the sheer difficulty of it. And yet, he could not shake the feeling that the land itself was changing under his feet. Then, without warning, the company wagons returned. Not 2 or 3 this time, but 8, their wheels heavy with crates, iron tools, and coils of thick rope. McKenna was with them, his smile sharper now. He didn't knock. He didn't wait to be invited. He simply told James, "We start work tomorrow. The papers are already signed." But James hadn't signed anything, and yet McKenna had something folded in his hand, a document bearing James's name in black ink. A perfect match to his signature, though James swore he had never touched a pen. That night, the lanterns in the Hollingsworth home burned until morning. James told his family they would stand their ground. But in the Highlands, standing your ground could mean more than you bargained for, because by the next sunset, the Hollingsworth family would be gone. Some say the company drove them out and buried the truth under the coal seams. Others whisper that the land itself took them, swallowed whole in a single night. But one thing is certain, when the company returned in 1855, it didn't just claim the coal. It claimed the Hollingsworths, and the ground they stood on was never the same again. In the Kentucky Highlands of 1855, life was carved from the rugged earth and tempered by the stubborn will of its people. It was a place where the wind whispered through endless hills, and the land was as much an enemy as it was a provider. But for one family, that land would become a grave. This is the haunting story of the Hollingsworths, a family swallowed whole by the very ground beneath their feet. It was November 17th. A rare, crisp morning. The air was clean, the sunlight spilling over the misty ridge lines like golden syrup. James Hollingsworth, a man of 42, was already in his fields before the sun had fully risen, cutting the last of the corn before winter claimed it. His wife, Margaret, moved quietly in their small log home, stoking the fire, kneading dough for cornbread. Inside, the smell of wood smoke and fresh flour filled the air. Outside, their 3 children, Samuel, aged 12, Ruth, 9, and little Thomas, only 5, played by the creek, their laughter carrying through the cool morning. It was a day that began like any other, and would end like no other. By mid-afternoon, the hills grew still, unnaturally still. Even the birds seemed to fall silent. A low, distant rumble began, faint at first, like thunder rolling behind the mountains. But it did not fade, it grew. The rumble became a growl, the ground itself beginning to tremble beneath their boots. James paused, his hands tightening around the wooden handle of his hoe. The sound wasn't moving across the sky. It was coming from beneath them. Then it happened. At the far edge of the Hollingsworth field, the soil began to sink, slowly at first, then all at once. The earth spiraled inward as though it were water being pulled down an unseen drain. Sod, roots, and stones tumbled into the dark, vanishing into an abyss that hadn't been there a moment before. From that black mouth in the earth, a rush of air blasted upward, hot, foul-smelling, and thick with the stench of sulfur and rotting earth. The force of it knocked James backward onto the ground. His ears rang, his eyes watered, and still the hole grew wider, deeper, hungrier. Margaret had stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron, her eyes widening in horror. The children had stopped playing, frozen in silence. It was as if the land itself had awoken from some ancient sleep, and it was starving. James called for his children to run toward the house. But the ground beneath Samuel's feet buckled, splitting open like paper. In an instant, Samuel vanished into the blackness. Ruth screamed and bolted toward her mother, but the earth beneath Margaret gave way. She, too, was gone before James could even reach her. The hole spread faster now, a jagged maw eating its way across the yard. The sound was deafening, cracking rock, tearing roots, and that endless roar from below. James lunged for Thomas, grabbing the boy's small arm, but the earth beneath them tilted violently. Both were pulled toward the abyss. James' fingers slipped, and the last thing he saw was Thomas's terrified face disappearing into the dark. A final rush of air exploded upward, carrying with it the smell of death and the sound of something deep beneath the earth. Something moving then, silence. The rumble was gone. The wind returned, soft and steady, as though nothing had happened. The field was empty, save for a fresh, jagged scar in the ground, a pit too deep to see the bottom. The Hollingsworth cabin stood quiet, the door still swinging open. No voices. No movement. Neighbors arrived hours later, drawn by the sound of the collapse. They stared into the black opening, tossing stones into the void, but none could hear them land. Some whispered of old mining tunnels beneath the ridge, abandoned and forgotten. Others spoke of curses and restless spirits from the frontier wars, buried deep and waiting. No bodies were ever recovered. No trace of the Hollingsworth family was ever found. The land eventually swallowed the pit. Grass grew over it. The Hollingsworth cabin rotted and fell, leaving only a patch of stones where the hearth once stood. But locals say that on certain nights, when the wind is right, you can still hear faint cries beneath the soil. In the Kentucky Highlands, the land remembers, and sometimes it takes back what it once gave. This was Season 5, The Ground Opens. The year was 1855, deep in the Kentucky Highlands, a rugged and unforgiving stretch of land where the mountains hid both treasure and tragedy. The McAllister family had lived on the same plot of land for generations, their log cabin perched on a ridge overlooking dense forests and black, jagged hills rich with coal. That coal had built fortunes for men far away, but for the McAllisters, it was simply part of the land, a silent, brooding presence beneath their feet. James McAllister was a hard man, forged by the wilderness, his hands calloused from years of felling timber and working the rocky soil. His wife, Margaret, was quieter but no less resilient, her voice often the only thing that could calm his stubborn impulses. Together, they raised 3 children: Samuel, the eldest at 14, who idolized his father; Ruth, 10 years old, curious and fearless; and little Henry, barely 6, whose wide eyes seemed to drink in every shadow. The trouble began after a night of unseasonable storms. Lightning flashed across the hills, thunder cracked through the valley, and rain lashed the cabin roof until the small hours of morning. When dawn came, the family emerged to find part of their pasture collapsed into a gaping hole. It was jagged and raw, edges crumbling into blackness. From its depths came a faint, damp smell: earth, coal dust, and something else, something older. Margaret told James to leave it be, to report it to the men in town, but James's curiosity was a stubborn thing. He fetched his lanterns, thick ropes, and a coil of determination that no warning could unwind. Telling the children to stay in the cabin, he looped the rope over a nearby tree and prepared to descend. The opening yawned like the mouth of some great buried beast. As James lowered himself down, the light from above faded, replaced by the dim flicker of his lantern. The walls around him were streaked with coal, their surface glittering faintly with minerals like 1,000 unblinking eyes. Water dripped steadily from above, echoing into the darkness below. When his boots finally hit the bottom, the ground crunched underfoot. That's when he saw them, wooden beams, old and rotting, propping up the walls of a tunnel. A rusted pickaxe lay abandoned across a heap of what looked like rocks. But as his lantern light fell upon them, he realized they were bones. Long buried, yellowed bones. The air felt suddenly heavier. He crouched closer, his breath clouding in the chill. Before he could touch the remains, a strange draft of air brushed his face, cold, unnaturally so, and in that instant, his lantern flame flickered and died. The darkness was absolute. In it, the mind seemed to breathe. And then, the whispering began. It was not the whisper of wind through a tunnel. No, these were voices. Low, urgent, layered atop one another, speaking words he could not understand. Some sounded close enough to be right at his ear, others drifted from deeper in the earth. James's heart hammered. He reached for his flint to relight the lantern, but the whispers only grew louder, their tones sharpening into something between pleading and warning. Up above, in the cabin, the children sat in silence. The rope that tethered their father to the surface began to sway, then went slack. Margaret's eyes fixed on that rope. She knew in her bones that something had gone terribly wrong. James McAllister had gone down into the earth. But it was not certain that the earth would ever let him back out, and in the days to come, the darkness beneath their land would reach up and claim more than just him. In the winter of 1855, the Kentucky Highlands were a place of both beauty and danger. Rolling ridges of black oak and sugar maple stood draped in frost, their branches cracking under the weight of ice. The coal seams beneath the hills kept the towns alive, but they also held secrets, secrets whispered about in the mining camps, in voices too low for children to hear. And among those whispers was one that would haunt the region for generations, the story of the family that vanished beneath the mine. It was late December, a night when the wind howled like an animal searching for prey. In a small cabin on the edge of a mining settlement, the Whitaker family gathered in uneasy silence. James Whitaker, a man hardened by years underground, sat at the table cleaning his shotgun. His wife, Margaret, stared into the dimming fire, her face pale and drawn. Their daughter Sarah, just 15, clutched a quilt around her shoulders, eyes fixed on the shadows creeping across the floor, That night, even the hearth seemed reluctant to burn. The flames hissed low, and every creak of the wooden walls felt louder than it should. Outside, the snow fell in heavy sheets, burying the path to the mine. It should have been a night for rest, but sleep never truly came. Around midnight, Sarah stirred. She thought she'd heard something, a sound so deep it felt like it was coming from beneath the earth itself. She lay still, listening. Then it came again, 3 heavy knocks, a pause, and then 3 more. Her breath caught. The sound wasn't coming from the door or the walls. It was under the floorboards. She sat up, calling softly for her father. James was already awake, sitting in the dark with the shotgun resting across his lap. His face was pale, his jaw tight. "I hear it," he said, barely above a whisper. The knocks came again. This time, the cabin seemed to shiver with each impact, as though the earth itself were answering some hidden command. Then came the smell, sharp, foul, and metallic, seeping into the room like a living thing. Sarah knew it instantly. It was the same stench that clung to her father's clothes after a long day in the mine. But this was stronger, thicker, as if the source was bleeding through the air. Margaret covered her mouth, her voice trembling. "James, we have to leave. Please." James shook his head. "If we run, we'll never stop." Outside, the wind screamed, but beneath it was another sound, a low, grinding rumble, like stones splitting apart far below the hills. The family sat together in the dark, the fire nearly out. Every so often, the knocking would return, always in that same pattern: 3, pause, 3. Sarah thought she saw movement in the corners of the room, small shapes, like shadows where no light should be. At one point, James stood, moving to the cellar door in the kitchen. He pressed his ear to the wood, then jerked back as if burned. "It's closer," he muttered. The stench grew unbearable. Margaret began to cry quietly, holding Sarah's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. Around 3 a.m., the sound changed. No longer knocks, now it was scratching. Long, slow drags of something hard across stone. The floor beneath their feet felt warmer, as if heat were rising from the ground. What happened next no one could fully explain. A neighbor, trudging through the snow the next morning, found the Whitaker cabin empty. The door was locked from the inside. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints, no broken glass. Only one thing stood out. The floorboards in the center of the room were cracked, sagging slightly inward, as if the earth below had shifted. Some say the family was claimed by the mine, taken by the same thing that had driven other men mad underground. Others whisper about an old coal seam beneath the cabin, one that miners swore was cursed long before anyone built a home there. To this day, the locals say that on certain winter nights, you can hear the knocking deep under the hills, 3 knocks, a pause, then 3 more. And if you smell that foul, metallic stench on the wind, it's already too late. The year was 1855, and the Kentucky Highlands were a rugged stretch of wilderness, steep hills covered in dense oak and maple, valleys carved by restless creeks, and hidden beneath it all, a network of coal veins that locals both feared and relied upon. The frontier spirit was alive here. People were stubborn, self-reliant, and wary of strangers. In these mountains, the land could feed you, or swallow you whole. James Whitaker was one of those stubborn souls. A farmer by trade, a coal digger by necessity. His wife, Margaret, had a quiet strength about her, the kind forged from years of hard winters and lean harvests. Together they raised their 3 children in a weathered clapboard house, perched on a ridge that overlooked a dark, wooded hollow. For years, life was predictable. Chopping wood, tending fields, hunting game. Until the summer that the earth itself seemed to shift beneath their feet. It began with a tremor, small at first, like a cart rolling past on a faraway road. But the sound came from below, deep and hollow, like something moving in the bedrock. Days later, James noticed a strange depression in the far corner of their property. The soil had cracked in a perfect ring, as if the ground had been punched from below. And at its center, a hole gaped open, jagged around the edges, breathing out air that smelled of wet stone and coal dust. Neighbors said it was nothing, just an old mine shaft from the days before the Whitakers settled here. Margaret begged James to leave it alone, to fence it off before the children got curious. But curiosity was already gnawing at him. What lay beneath their land? An abandoned tunnel full of forgotten coal? Relics from miners long gone? Or something else entirely? One overcast evening, when the wind rattled the tree branches and the clouds pressed low against the hills, James made his choice. Against Margaret's pleas, he gathered 2 lanterns, a coil of rope, and a pickaxe. He told his children firmly to stay inside, their faces pale in the flickering firelight. Then, without another word, he headed toward the hole. The descent was harder than he imagined. The rope scraped along the raw edges of stone as he lowered himself down, his lantern casting trembling shadows along the walls. The shaft was narrow at first, but then it widened into a sloping tunnel. The walls were streaked with veins of black coal and glittering minerals that caught the lamplight like frost. The air was cold, almost wet, and carried a metallic tang that clung to the back of his throat. At the bottom, his boots crunched on loose gravel. That's when his lantern light caught something strange. Not natural rock, but wooden beams, old and rotting, holding up what looked like the entrance to a man-made tunnel. Lying across the ground was a rusted pickaxe, half buried in dust, and beside it, bones. Yellowed, splintered, human bones. James's breath caught in his chest. He took a cautious step forward, the lantern swinging in his hand. The bones were jumbled, as though whoever they belonged to had collapsed mid-step. He was about to kneel when a sudden rush of cold air blasted through the tunnel. The flame in his lantern wavered, then went out completely. Darkness swallowed him. The silence was crushing, broken only by the sound of his own heartbeat, until it wasn't silent anymore. From somewhere ahead, faint and almost too low to hear, came a sound like whispering. Not one voice, but many. Layered, overlapping, speaking words he couldn't understand. They seemed to shift around him, moving from one ear to the other, as though the tunnel itself was breathing secrets into the dark. James stumbled backward, hands scraping against the damp rock, trying to find the rope. But the ground beneath him seemed unfamiliar now, the space distorted. The whispering grew louder, more urgent, until it felt like the voices were inside his skull. He shouted for them to stop, but his voice came back twisted, echoing wrong, as if the tunnel was mocking him. And then, silence again. When James didn't return by morning, Margaret called for neighbors to help search. They found the rope still tied to the tree above the hole, but it hung slack, no sign of James. When a man from town volunteered to go down after him, he reported something strange. The tunnel at the bottom was gone. In its place was solid rock, as if it had never existed. By the end of that week, the Whitaker children were sent to live with relatives. Margaret stayed behind, unable to leave the home she and James had built. But before the year was out, she too had vanished. The neighbors spoke in hushed tones about strange lights flickering in the hollow at night, and a sound like whispering carrying on the wind. To this day, the hole remains, though it has narrowed with time. Travelers sometimes stop to peer down into the darkness. Most say they hear nothing. But a few claim that if you listen closely enough, you can still hear the voices, calling out from somewhere deep underground, waiting for someone else to come down and join them. The year was 1855. The Kentucky Highlands were a rugged, unforgiving stretch of land where the forest grew thick and the hills hid secrets far older than the towns that clung to their slopes. This was coal country, black gold buried deep beneath the earth, mined by rough hands and dangerous tools. Men ventured into the dark each day, knowing full well that the mountain could swallow them without warning. On a cold autumn morning, James Holloway, a farmer by trade and miner by necessity, noticed something strange on the far edge of his property. The heavy rains of the week before had caused the ground to collapse, revealing a jagged opening in the hillside. The air that seeped from it was unnaturally cold, carrying a faint, metallic scent, like rusted iron and wet stone. Margaret, his wife, stood at the doorway of their small cabin, clutching her shawl tightly. "James," she said, her voice trembling, "leave it. There's nothing in there worth finding." But James's eyes narrowed with curiosity. For years, rumors had swirled among the miners about forgotten tunnels carved long before the official records of the mines. Places where entire crews had gone missing, where the earth's breath came out in cold gusts, and where no man returned the same, if he returned at all. Ignoring her pleas, James fetched 2 lanterns, a coil of rope, and his old mining pick. "Stay inside," he told his children firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. The Holloway children, Thomas, aged 12, and little Annie, barely 8, watched from the window as their father tied the rope around a sturdy tree and began his descent into the black mouth of the earth. The opening was far deeper than he expected. His lantern light revealed walls streaked with rich seams of coal, shimmering with flecks of mica that caught the glow like tiny stars. But there was something else, a dampness in the air, heavy and still, as though the mine was holding its breath. Halfway down, James's boot struck something solid. He steadied himself and leaned closer. There, half buried in loose earth, were ancient wooden beams, rotting and splintered, the remnants of some long-forgotten mining shaft. And just beyond them, resting against the black wall, lay a rusted pickaxe, its handle worn smooth with age. He moved his lantern forward, and that's when he saw them, bones. Human bones. A collapsed rib cage. The twisted remains of a miner's helmet. The hollow sockets of a skull staring back at him through the dust of decades. James swallowed hard. The silence was absolute, until it wasn't. A sudden gust of icy wind rushed through the shaft, snuffing out his lantern in an instant. The darkness was total, a suffocating blackness so deep that James couldn't see his own hand before his face. And then he heard it, whispering. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the wind, but growing clearer, words in a language he didn't recognize. The voices seemed to come from all around him, circling, closing in. His heart pounded as the whispers swelled into urgent murmurs, layered and overlapping, each one trying to be heard over the other. James tried to climb back up, but the rope felt different now, slick, as if wet with something thick. The whispers grew faster, almost frantic, and a cold hand, or what felt like one, brushed the back of his neck. Above, Margaret stood in the doorway, her shawl clutched tight. She could still see the rope tied to the tree, but it wasn't moving anymore. That night, the Holloway cabin remained lit with a single candle burning in the window. But James never came back, and by morning neither did Margaret. Nor Thomas. Nor little Annie. The rope was still tied to the tree. But the hole? It was gone. The earth had sealed itself again, as though it had never been there at all. To this day, in the quiet hills of the Kentucky Highlands, miners speak of a family that vanished into the coal, a family whose whispers you might hear if you linger too long near the old shafts when the wind turns cold.